Hey guys, I did my project on the ethics of the methods of factory farming, uh, particularly animals that we mass produce in order to, feed the population with meat, dairy, eggs, anything that comes from an animal. This is as opposed to the old fashioned methods of family farming, where family farms or local farms would feed the local people. Um, their ways of living were much different. It was more natural, grazing on farms, on the grass, or they had land to walk around on, sunshine. Um, and slaughter was more concentrated on, as in general, they would do it themselves. There was more insurance that they would die quickly, or as quickly as possible. Whereas opposed to factory farms, some animals don't ever see the light of day in their lives. Um, they are usually slaughtered by machines, and it's not as accurate. Some of them don't die immediately. They might bleed out for a few hours. Without getting too graphic, it's not. Um, it's more efficient numbers wise, but not really like paying attention to each individual animal and the quality of how it was slaughtered or even raised. And there's also, uh, special breeding in order to fatten up cows or chickens or pigs, in order to make more meat. And so these particular breeds cannot survive. They're not the natural form, that they used to be. They cannot survive on their own. Um, they just can't, because of their different biology and anatomy. They're all modified animals. So this is in order to make more product with a little bit less animals, even though there's hundreds of thousands of them. Um, so that's the two different sides. So meat eaters might argue that we've always eaten meat, we've always needed it. We need it for essential nutrients, iron, zinc, calcium, vitamin D. We need meat and dairy products for certain nutrients. Um, and this is a combination of a poll that I took on my social media page, as well as research into different sources, and those are the most common arguments, as well as some were raised on a farm. They never really thought about the difference between farm-raised animals and factory-farmed animals. They've always done it themselves. They just are familiar with the process. Some people have never even really thought about it because they've never been exposed to anything, that they've never been exposed to the process in general. You never really think about it because we all just buy it from the store. We don't have to think about it. So there's also the argument that we are anatomically designed to eat meat, but I could not find any studies that support that definitively, either and on either side, really. So, but there is a hypothesis from I think it was Berkeley, and it proposed that the earliest humans uh, relied on plant sources for energy, primarily, and then out of a developing habit, they would kill for meat and protein, and they don't believe that there's any evidence um, that we did that due to how we are anatomically designed. And so, for vegetarians or vegans, or maybe even people who just like to limit meat, they might argue that obviously the most common one is animal welfare and the rights of animals. Due to the process that they go through, never seeing the light of day. They don't eat what they're supposed to. Instead of eating grass or whatever, they'll eat grains or drink contaminated water. Living in their feces, and they have antibiotics and growth hormones pumped into their bodies and all that stuff. So there's that, the low quality living conditions overall in general. And obviously, the environment is another really common argument, but also the fact that meat eaters might argue that vegans or vegetarians lack a lot of nutrients, but according to a lot of the studies that I found, meat eaters also lack the same or other nutrients. So there's kind of the argument for each side is sort of invalid because in any diet, according to the research I found, everyone is lacking in some nutrient, and most often they are either side is lacking, it is still taking under the recommended daily intake of most nutrients. So researchers concluded that the general public does need more education on the nutrients and health overall in regards to the foods that we eat. So oh yeah, and then in defense for meat eaters, the FDA recently, I think it was last year, they declared red meat as a carcinogen. And there are some studies that support that, it might increase the risk of like colon cancer is the most common one if you eat a lot of meat long term. But I have also seen a couple studies and reviews that said that there were a lot of methodological issues and contradictions in these studies that don't have sufficient evidence that red meat does cause cancer, but it's still a potential, though the risk is pretty low if you're going to relate it directly to eating red meat. So I wanted to go over some the studies that in support of vegetarian or mostly plant-based eaters. It not only did they have a relatively sufficient amount of nutrients in comparison to meat eaters. They're about the same. They, in regards to disease, there's actually a lot of evidence that eating a more plant-based diet and less meat has helped people with type 2 diabetes actually reverse it and dull it down. So let's see, in one particular study, there was an 82% decrease in the symptoms of people with type 2 diabetes, and 43% of those people could lower their medications drastically for type 2 diabetes after eating a mostly plant-based diet. And so that's generally the two most common benefits in the research that I found for a vegetarian diet. So I wanted to give some facts on how, so researchers overall, there's not much evidence or research that supports that eating meat is really good for the environment at all. In fact, most of the research I found was that meat diets are extremely bad for the environment. And well, honestly, even plant-based diets, they use a lot of resources. They use a lot of water. Both diets, because of such the drastic growth in population over time, that it's gonna keep explode. It's not gonna slow down at all. And so the ways in which we produce our food, both for plant-based eaters and meat eaters, is highly unsustainable. And so about 80% of the fresh water in the US is used for food production in general, for both meat and plant-based foods. And, that's ridiculous and unsustainable if you ask me. But, and some more facts, the US livestock population consumes more than 7 times as much grain as is consumed by the American population. So the amount of animals that we are producing just to feed people is taking away from our own resources that we could have, otherwise used more sustainably in order to feed ourselves. We are sort of wasting our resources to make meat products when we could have those products for ourselves directly. And excuse me, there's also a study that, no, there's not a study, there's many studies in which people interviewed people that there was a direct correlation between those who cared about animal welfare and ate less or no meat and dairy products, who had either exposure or education to how the factory farming system is. So, excuse me, my opinion is that if it's easy to ignore this issue if you don't see it directly with your eyes, if you don't, if you're living your everyday life just fine, you go to the grocery store, grab some meat, it's easy to ignore the issue or to not care. So researchers definitely found that there was a correlation between people who took action against this and, in regards to the education and exposure. So, like I said, according to all the studies, a majority of them agree that the environment and population growth, like that, it's like the biggest issue with food production in general. So I watched this documentary that came out this year. It's called 2 Degrees, The Point of No Return. And it basically summarized what all the studies are saying, that I think we have passed the 2-degree point now. It's 400 parts per million for greenhouse emissions. So we have definitely passed that point, and what that means is that there's not really anything that we can do now to reverse the impact of global warming. So all these natural disasters, we've never had 3 major hurricanes in one season. We've never had that before. And so it's events like this, earthquakes, wildfires, unfortunately, it's going to keep happening because it's kind of breaking that point has triggered sort of a domino effect, and things are only going to get worse. So I think the biggest thing right now, ethically, morally, whether or not you eat meat or whether or not you're opposed to it, the way in which we produce food is not sustainable. And so that's basically the bottom line. So in regards to the environment, this is just a small samples between 2004 and 2005 to give you some sort of perspective that nearly 3 million acres of the rainforest in just the Amazon were cleared purely for the purpose of growing crops to feed animals. And in the United States alone, 260 million acres of forest land has been replaced with cropland for these animals, for factory farm animals. And so obviously greenhouse gases are at an all-time high. Over 51% of global greenhouse emissions are produced purely from animal agriculture. So besides the factories themselves, cows' manure produce methane gas, and that is 20 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So, given the amount of livestock that we have, we're just accelerating um, the greenhouse gas emissions, and not to mention the factories themselves run on fossil fuels and all these excuse me, unsustainable resources. So that is basically like the whole reason. I think the bottom line is just environment when it comes to the ethics of factory farming. It's hard to um, create a solid argument, for animal welfare, because that can come down to people's religious beliefs. Do animals have souls? Like, does it really matter? And so it's really hard to solidify either argument. So I think it basically just comes down to the environment and the way in which we produce our food. And thank you for listening.